protects. The silence was her oldest friend. It was a living thing, a cloak she had woven thread by thread for 10 turnings of the seasons. Each thread was a word not spoken, a scream not uttered, a name not called. It wrapped around her, heavy and familiar, her only shield in a world that had discarded her for the crime of having no voice. Elara pressed her hand against the rough bark of an ancient ironwood tree. Its stillness seeped into her skin, a quiet communion she understood better than any spoken language. This forest, the vast and untamed Whisperwood, was her sanctuary and her prison. Here, her silence was not a flaw. It was merely part of the greater hush of the woods, lost among the rustle of leaves, the sigh of the wind, and the soft pad of unseen paws on damp earth. She had fled here years ago, a girl of 16, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a vow burning on her soul. A vow of silence. He will sell you for scrap, daughter. A mute is of no use. Less than a beast, for a beast can at least be trained to a call. Her father's words were a scar on her memory, a wound that never fully healed. He had looked at her not with paternal affection, but with the cold calculation of a merchant assessing damaged goods. She was a commodity that had failed to meet its expected value. The auction block had loomed in her nightmares, a platform of public humiliation where her worthlessness would be declared for all to see. So she had run. She had run until her lungs burned and her feet bled, until the manicured fields of her father's lands gave way to the wild, teeth-like embrace of the forest. She had made her vow then, under the light of a fractured moon. A promise to a forgotten power, a desperate bargain for protection. She would not speak again, not until she found the one whose soul sang the same desperate lonely song as hers. Not until her silence was no longer a void, but a vessel waiting to be filled. It was a child's foolish romantic notion, born of terror and storybooks. Yet, the vow had taken root. It had become a part of her, as real and binding as the bones in her body. Now, 10 years later, Elara was a creature of the wood. Her skin was tanned by the sun that dappled through the canopy, her hair a wild tangle of brown and gold, and her eyes held the watchful calm of a doe. She knew the secret paths of the deer and the hunting grounds of the hawk. She could read the language of the bent grass and the broken twig. A small, furred creature with wide, dark eyes poked its head from her satchel. She smiled, a rare and gentle thing, and stroked its head with one finger. The vesper mouse chittered softly, a sound of pure contentment. The animals of the forest did not fear her. Her silence was a balm to them, a sign that she was not a threat. They were her companions, her court, her family. This quiet life was all she had, and all she thought she would ever have. But the world beyond the Whisperwood was not quiet. It was a place of iron and fire, ruled by kings and their ambitions. And the lands bordering her forest belonged to the most feared of them all, King Kaelen, the Alpha King of the Shadowlands. Even here, in her isolated world, whispers of his name were carried on the wind. They called him the Beast King, a ruler forged in the heart of a volcano, with a temper as fiery and unpredictable as the molten rock. His kingdom was harsh and unforgiving, a reflection of its master. A land where strength was the only virtue, and weakness was a death sentence. The stories claimed his rage was a physical force, a storm that could break armies and shatter the will of men. They said he was cursed, that a primal beast lived within his skin, barely contained by a king's discipline. Elara shivered, though the air was mild. She had always been careful to stay deep within the woods, far from the patrols that sometimes skirted its edges. The king's warriors were said to be as merciless as their lord. Trespassers were not taken prisoner. They were made examples of. A sudden sound broke the forest's peace. It was not the natural snap of a twig. It was the sharp metallic clang of armor and the heavy, rhythmic tread of booted feet. Too close. Far too close. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of her calm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. She froze, melting back against the ironwood tree, willing it to swallow her whole. The Vesper mouse sensed her terror and burrowed deeper into her satchel, trembling. Through a screen of ferns, she saw them. Warriors, clad in black iron armor etched with the snarling wolf's head of the Shadowlands. They moved with a predator's purpose, their eyes scanning the trees. They were a hunting party, and she was the prey. Her breath caught in her throat. Run, a primal part of her screamed. But her feet were roots, tangled in the forest floor. To run was to be seen. To be seen was to die, power Ardis down. Then, he appeared. He moved through the center of his warriors, like a shadow given form. He was taller than the rest, broader in the shoulder, with an aura of absolute authority that commanded the very air around him. He wore no helmet, and his hair was as black as a raven's wing, swept back from a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. King Kaelen. Even from a distance, his presence was overwhelming. Han. A physical weight that pressed down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. He stopped, his head tilting, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. His gaze, the color of a winter storm, swept through the trees. Elara's blood turned to ice. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he was looking for her. His eyes scanned past her hiding spot, once, twice. She held her breath, praying to the old gods, to the spirit of the forest, to anything that might be listening. Do not see me. His gaze snapped back. It locked onto hers. There was no screen of ferns, no shadow that could hide her now. He saw her. He saw right through her, into the silent, terrified core of her soul. The world stopped. The forest held its breath with her. For a long, terrible moment, there was only the sight of him, a dark king in a green world, and the silent scream trapped behind her lips. He took a step forward. The hunt was over. His warriors followed his gaze, their hands immediately going to the hilts of their swords. Hard faces, scarred and brutal, turned on her. They saw a trespasser, a waif, prey. One of them, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, drew his blade with a rasp of steel. A forest witch, he snarled, his voice a gravelly affront to the wood's quiet. The king's justice is swift for your kind. Elara flinched, her back pressing so hard against the ironwood she thought the bark might tear her skin. Panic was a wild bird beating its wings inside her chest. She had to run. But where? Peesh. They had her surrounded, a ring of iron and death. King Kaelen raised a single, leather-gloved hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. The warrior froze instantly, his sword half raised, his expression shifting from aggression to absolute, unquestioning obedience. Place. The king's eyes never left hers. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, each step a hammer blow against her crumbling composure. The other men parted for him, a silent, disciplined wave. He was the storm, and they were merely the thunder that followed. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that she could smell the scent of leather, steel, and something else. Something wild and elemental, like ozone after a lightning strike. It was terrifying. And it was intoxicating. A strange, forgotten part of her. The inner spirit that had been dormant for a decade, stirred in recognition. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. It was not a human sound, predator. It was the sound of a predator, possessive and absolute, a sound that vibrated through the ground and up into her bones. His eyes darkened, the storm within them churning. Mine. The word did not echo in the clearing. It exploded in her mind. A psychic claim, so powerful and raw it nearly brought her to her knees. Her own inner self, her hidden, silent wolf, whimpered in response. It was a feeling of being found after a lifetime of being lost. It was the most terrifying and wonderful feeling she had ever known. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a trespasser, or a witch, or a worthless mute. He looked at her as if he were a starving man and she were a feast. His gaze catalogued her tangled hair, her wide, frightened eyes, the simple, worn tunic she wore. It was an inspection that should have felt demeaning, but instead, it felt like reverence. "Who are you?" he finally asked. His voice was deeper than she could have imagined, a low baritone that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. It was a command, not a question. Elara could only stare, her throat locked tight by her vow. The panic returned, sharper this time. He was a king. He had commanded her to speak. To disobey was treason, treason was death. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head minutely. A flicker of something annoyance, confusion, crossed his face. The scarred warrior spoke again, his voice full of contempt. "She's a mute, your majesty, useless. Let us be done with her." The king's head snapped toward the man. His eyes blazed with a sudden, terrifying fury. "Pottery." "Gideon," he said, his voice dropping to a lethally soft growl. "You will be silent, or I will silence you permanently." The warrior, Gideon, paled and bowed his head low. "Forgive me, my king." Kaelen turned his attention back to Elara. The rage was gone from his eyes as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that same intense, possessive focus. He reached out, his gloved fingers moving slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. She was mesmerized. His fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was shockingly gentle. A spark, hot and electric, shot through her at the point of contact, racing down her spine. It was the opposite of the cold dread she had expected. It was warmth. It was life. He was the Alpha King, the beast of the Shadowlands, a man whose cruelty was legend, and he had just performed an act of unexpected, breathtaking kindness. He had defended her. He had touched her, as if she were precious. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his expression unreadable. "You are coming with me," he stated. It was not a request. It was a fact. The world was being remade around her, and she was powerless to stop it. Two of his warriors moved forward at his unspoken command. They were huge mountains of muscle and iron. Fear clawed at her throat again. She took an involuntary step back, her hand flying to the satchel where the Vesper mouse was hidden. Kaelen saw the movement. He saw her fear. "Do not touch her," he commanded his men, his voice sharp. "I will take her." He turned his back on her for a moment, addressing his second in command. "Gideon, the hunt is over. Take the men and return to the keep. See that quarters are prepared, in my wing." Gideon's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his training took over. "My king?" he questioned, his voice laced with disbelief. "In your wing? Did I stutter?" Kaelen's voice was dangerously low. "No, your majesty." Gideon bowed stiffly. "It will be done." He barked orders, and the warriors began to withdraw, their faces a mixture of confusion and rigid obedience. They cast backward glances at Elara, glances that held a new emotion. Not contempt, awe, and fear. Soon, they were alone. Just Elara and the Beast King, standing in the cathedral-like silence of the ancient woods. He turned back to her, and the raw power of his presence seemed to double without the buffer of his men. "You will not be harmed," he said, and the words sounded like a vow, as solemn and binding as her own. He held out his hand. It was an invitation, an order cloaked in civility. For 10 years, she had been a ghost, hidden from the world. Now, her fate stood before her, clad in black leather and iron, with eyes that promised storms and salvation. She had 2 choices: refuse, and likely die here, in the quiet woods she called home, or accept, and step into the heart of the storm itself. Her own soul, that strange inner wolf, was howling its answer. Go. He is the one. With a trembling hand, Elara reached out and placed her small, calloused palm into his large, gloved one. His fingers closed around hers, strong and secure. He was not saving her from a worse fate. He was her fate. And as he led her out of the Whisperwood, away from the only home she had ever known, Elara did not feel like a captive. She felt like she was finally going home. The Obsidian Keep was not a castle. It was a wound in the landscape. Jagged black towers clawed at the sky, hewn from the living rock of the mountain itself. It loomed over a valley cloaked in perpetual shadow, a fortress built to intimidate, to dominate, to crush the spirit of any who approached. As they rode through the massive iron-banded gates, Elara felt the weight of the place settle on her like a shroud. The air here was different. It tasted of cold stone, smoke, and spilled blood. The courtyard was a field of packed, dark earth, teeming with warriors. Everywhere she looked, she saw the same hard faces, the same black iron armor, the same snarling wolf sigil. This was a kingdom built for war. Compassion was a foreign language here. Her silence, once a shield, now felt like a glaring vulnerability, a weakness to be exploited. Kaelen dismounted in one fluid motion, his presence silencing the clamor of the courtyard. Men stopped their training, their conversations, their work, and bowed their heads in deference. The Alpha's authority was absolute. He turned and lifted his arms for her. Before she could react, his strong hands were on her waist, lifting her from the horse as if she weighed nothing. Power. For a dizzying moment, she was pressed against the hard wall of his chest. The scent of him leather, lightning, and that wild, untamed musk filled her senses. Her heart stuttered. The inner wolf purred. He set her down gently, but his hands lingered at her waist for a second too long, a possessive gesture for all his men to see. He was claiming her, publicly. Murmurs rippled through the courtyard. Eyes followed her, full of shock, suspicion, and a dawning, grudging respect. She was not a prisoner to be thrown in a cell. She was something more, something belonging to the king. Gideon, his scarred face a mask of professionalism, approached. "Your Majesty, the rooms are prepared as you commanded." "Good," Kaelen said, his hand moving from her waist to the small of her back, a guiding pressure that sent shivers through her. "See that she has brought food and water, and a bath." His gaze swept over her worn tunic, and for the first time, Elara felt self-conscious, ashamed of her ragged appearance. "And clothes," he added, his voice a low growl. "Something suitable." He began to lead her toward the main entrance of the keep, a gaping maw of carved stone that looked like the mouth of some great beast. The guards at the door, giants in polished armor, snapped to attention and slammed their fists over their hearts in salute. Inside, the keep was a labyrinth of dark stone and flickering torchlight. The air was cold, the silence heavy and oppressive. It was the antithesis of her forest, a place of manufactured stillness, not natural peace. They walked through cavernous halls where the only decoration was a display of weapons or a tattered battle standard. Servants and courtiers flattened themselves against the walls as they passed, their eyes downcast. Fear was the currency of this realm. Kaelen led her up a winding staircase, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Pasada. His hand never left her back, a constant, warm presence that was both a comfort and a brand. They entered a wing of the keep that was clearly his own. The stone floors were covered with thick, dark furs. The air was warmer, fed by a massive fireplace that roared at the end of the corridor. He stopped before a heavy oak door. "This will be your room," he said, his voice softer now that they were away from the prying eyes of his court. He pushed the door open, revealing a chamber that was larger than her entire hut in the forest. A huge bed piled high with furs dominated one wall. A fire crackled in a private hearth. Through a stone archway, she could see a bathing chamber with a deep copper tub, It was a room of stark masculine luxury, and it was directly connected to another, even larger room through an open doorway. His room. The forced proximity was a shock, and he was not just keeping her close, part of his personal space. His den. "You will be safe here," he said, his storm gray eyes searching her face. "No one will harm you." He was offering her protection, but the greatest danger in this keep, she suspected, was him. A commotion at the door made them both turn. A servant girl, no older than Elara had been when she fled, entered carrying a tray of food. She was followed by two others carrying steaming buckets of water. The lead girl, whose face was pinched with jealousy, set the tray down with a clatter. "Powers." Her eyes, sharp and resentful, flickered over Elara's simple clothes with disdain. "Will that be all, Your Majesty?" The girl, Seraphina, asked, her voice syrupy sweet but her eyes full of venom. She was clearly used to being the object of the king's attention, however fleeting. Elara was an intruder. A rival. "Leave," Kaelen commanded, his tone flat and dismissive. He did not even look at the servant. His entire attention was fixed on Elara. The girl's face tightened, and she shot Elara a look of pure hatred before curtsying and backing out of the room. The other servants quickly filled the tub and scurried away, leaving them alone once more. The scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air, making Elara's stomach ache with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. She hadn't had a real meal in a decade. Kaelen gestured to the food. "Eat." She hesitated. To accept his hospitality felt like a surrender. Potter's. But her body betrayed her. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing rumble in the quiet room. A ghost of a smile touched Kaelen's lips. It transformed his harsh face, making him look younger, almost human. "Eat," he said again, his voice laced with amusement. Slowly, she approached the table. She sat on the edge of a heavy chair and reached for a piece of bread, her movements stiff and uncertain. The bread was warm and soft. She took a small bite, and the taste was so overwhelming she almost wept. She ate quickly then, unable to stop herself, tearing at the bread and the meat with a ferocity that shamed her. She was behaving like a wild animal, which she supposed was what she was. She looked up, expecting to see disgust on his face. Instead, he was watching her with an expression of intense satisfaction, as if her enjoyment was a personal victory for him. When she was finished, he pushed a goblet of water toward her. She drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat. A throat that could not form the words to thank him. She looked at him, trying to convey her gratitude with her eyes. He seemed to understand. "Your bath is ready," he said, his gaze dropping to the copper tub. "I will have clothes sent in." He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway to his own chambers. He looked back at her, his expression serious. "Do not try to run, little mouse," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "There is nowhere in my kingdom you could hide from me." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the vast, luxurious cage he had built for her. Elara stared at the steam rising from the bath. She was trapped, a prisoner of the Beast King. So why did her soul feel more free than it ever had before? The days that followed fell into a strange, disorienting rhythm. Elara existed in a gilded cage, a silent ghost haunting the Alpha King's private wing. She was not given tasks. She was not treated as a servant. She was treated as a guest, an object of intense curiosity and value. Fresh clothes appeared each morning, simple but well-made gowns of soft wool in shades of forest green and deep earth brown. Meals were brought on silver trays. The fire was always lit, the room always warm. It was a life of comfort she could never have imagined. And it was utterly terrifying. She spent her hours exploring her gilded prison. The window in her room looked out over the sheer cliff face. The keep was built upon a drop of thousands of feet to a river of churning black water below. There was no escape that way. The only exit was the door that led to the corridor, and the open archway that led to his chambers. She never dared to cross that threshold, but she could see into his room. It was even more stark than hers, dominated by a massive, fur-draped bed and a weapon rack holding an array of brutal-looking swords and axes. A huge stone hearth stood cold and black. He never seemed to light it. He was the fire in his own room. He sought her out. In the evenings, after a day of holding court or training his warriors, he would appear in the doorway between their rooms. He would not speak at first. He would simply stand there, watching her. His presence was a physical force, filling the room, making the air thick and heavy. Elara would sit by her own fire, her hands busy mending a tunic or stroking the Vesper mouse, which she had named Pip. She would pretend not to notice him, but her skin would prickle with awareness. Every nerve ending was attuned to him. "Tell me your name," he said one night, his voice cutting through the comfortable silence. She looked up, her heart giving a painful lurch. She could not. The vow was a physical barrier in her throat. She shook her head. A small, sad gesture. Frustration tightened the lines of his jaw. "Why do you refuse me? Do you not have a name?" How could she explain a decade-old promise made in desperation and terror? How could she explain that her voice was bound to a fate she barely understood herself? She looked down at her hands, her silence, her only answer. He sighed, a sound of deep exasperation, but he did not press her. Instead, he walked into her room and sat in the heavy chair opposite hers. The space between them crackled with unspoken tension. "The servants are afraid of you," he commented, his eyes fixed on her face. "They think you are a sorceress who has enchanted me." Elara's eyes widened in alarm. "Witch? Sorceress?" These were words that got women burned. He saw her fear. "You have not," he said, and it was a statement of fact, not a question. "I would know." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "But there is a power in you. I feel it. A quiet that answers the storm in me." His voice was low, confessional. He was speaking of his curse, the beast that lived under his skin. The stories were true. She could feel it too. A constant, simmering rage just beneath his controlled surface. A wild, chaotic energy that frightened his people and isolated him on his throne. And yet, when he was near her, she could feel that storm, quiet. The churning chaos seemed to gentle, the waves smoothing into a calmer sea. Her own innate ability, the silent empathy that soothed the animals of the forest, was working on him. Power, the most dangerous beast of all. One night, a terrible screaming echoed from his chambers. Not a scream of pain, but of pure, unrestrained rage. It was followed by the splintering crash of furniture and a guttural roar that was wholly inhuman. Elara shot to her feet, her blood running cold. Pip scrambled to hide under the bed. The curse was upon him. The beast was loose. Fear told her to barricade the door, to hide. But her soul, her inner wolf, urged her forward. "Go to him. He needs you." Trembling, she took a tentative step toward the archway. She peered into his room. It was chaos. A heavy table was overturned, chairs smashed to kindling, and in the center of the room stood Kaelen. His body was rigid, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. His eyes were no longer gray. They were glowing, molten gold, the eyes of a predator. A low snarl ripped from his throat as he saw her. He took a stalking step toward her. This was not the king. This was the beast, and it was looking at her like she was prey. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she stood her ground. She held his gaze, and instead of projecting fear, she focused all her will, all her silent, empathetic power, on a single, unspoken thought: peace. She poured all the quiet of her soul, all the calm of her forest sanctuary, into that one mental word. She sent it across the space between them like a gentle wave. The beast in his eyes faltered. He stopped, his head cocked, a look of confusion warring with the rage on his face. He blinked, and the molten gold receded, leaving behind the stormy gray she knew. The tension drained from his body. He staggered back, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in great gulps. He looked at the destruction around him, then back at her. Shame and self-loathing washed over his features. He had almost lost control. He had almost hurt her. He sank onto the edge of his bed, burying his face in his hands. His broad shoulders slumped in defeat. Slowly, cautiously, Elara walked into his room. She approached him as she would a wounded wolf, her movements slow and non-threatening. She stopped before him and hesitated for only a moment before reaching out. She laid her hand gently on his shoulder. He flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. His muscles were corded with tension beneath her palm. She said nothing. She did nothing. She simply stood there, her small hand on his shoulder, offering a silent, unwavering anchor in his storm. After a long time, he lifted his head. His eyes were filled with a raw, aching vulnerability she had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had been utterly alone for a very long time. "How?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "How do you do that?" She could not answer. She could only meet his gaze and let him see the truth in her eyes. "I don't know." He reached up and covered her hand with his own. His skin was hot against hers. Powers. The mate bond, the connection between their souls, flared to life, a current of warmth and recognition passing between them. In that moment, standing in the wreckage of his rage, surrounded by the evidence of his curse, Elara was not afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was falling in love with the monster. The incident changed things. The invisible wall between their rooms dissolved. Kaelen no longer stood in the doorway, a visitor in her space. He started spending all his evenings with her, sitting by her fire, a silent, brooding presence. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was a shared language. A space where he could let the mask of the Alpha King fall, where the storm inside him could rest. He began to talk. Not about his curse, not directly, but about his kingdom. About the burden of the crown, the constant threat of war from neighboring lands, the harsh realities of ruling a harsh people. He spoke, and she listened, her quiet attention a balm to his weary soul. She was his confessor, his sanctuary. One evening, he brought a whetstone and one of his massive swords into her room. He sat by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the silence. The firelight danced on the sharp edge of the blade and highlighted the concentration on his face. Elara watched him, her needle pausing in its work. There was a brutal grace in the way he moved, a deadly purpose in the simple act of sharpening a weapon. He was a warrior to his very core, Pracio Mares. He caught her watching, and a rare, small smile touched his lips. "My father taught me this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He said a king who cannot maintain his own blade is not fit to rule." He paused, his expression turning grim. "He also gave me this." He gestured vaguely at his own chest, at the space where the beast resided. "The curse. It runs in my bloodline, a gift from a vengeful sorceress generations ago. It grows stronger with each heir." Enide. He was finally telling her, trusting her with his deepest, most dangerous secret. Her heart ached for him, for the boy who had inherited not just a crown, but a monster. "It demands blood," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Rage. It feeds on it. The more I fight, the more I rule with an iron fist, the stronger it becomes. But if I show weakness, my enemies will tear this kingdom, and me, apart." He was trapped, caught between the monster within and the monsters without. "But with you," he looked up, his gray eyes piercing her. "When you are near, it sleeps." He set the sword and stone aside and stood up. He walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit chasm. There are legends, he said, his back to her. Old stories the court mages dismiss as fantasy. They speak of a mate, a destined one, a soul forged as a key for the lock of the curse. He turned around, his face illuminated by the silver moonlight spilling through the window. It softened the harsh planes of his face, making him look almost ethereal. They say her presence can soothe the beast. Her voice can tame it. Her touch can break the curse. He took a step toward her, and another, until he was standing before her chair, looking down at her. I did not believe in legends, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. I did not believe in hope. He knelt before her, so his eyes were level with hers. The great and terrible Alpha King, kneeling to a silent, nameless girl from the forest. The power imbalance between them had never felt so vast, and yet so meaningless. You are my hope, he whispered, his voice raw. He reached out and took her hand, lifting it to his lips. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his lips warm and firm against her skin. The gesture was one of profound reverence. I feel it, he said, his eyes burning into hers. The bond between us, my soul knows yours. It has been calling for you since the day I was born. This was it. The declaration. The acknowledgement of the fated bond that had drawn them together. Her own inner wolf was howling in triumph, in joy. He knows, he feels it too. You are my mate, he declared, his voice ringing with certainty. My queen. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of fierce possession and desperate pleading. Say my name, he begged, his voice cracking. Let me hear the voice that the legends say can save me. Break your silence for me, please. Ice flooded her veins. The joy curdled into pure, agonizing dread. The vow? Her foolish, 10-year-old vow. I will not speak until I find the one whose soul sings the same song as mine. He was the one. She knew it with every fiber of her being. But the vow had a second part. A part she had buried deep, a part tied to the secret she protected. A secret about a hidden place of power in the forest. To break her silence before the appointed time, before the conditions were met, would have devastating consequences. It would shatter the very magic she was sworn to protect. She couldn't. She couldn't speak. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. This was a cruel, twisted joke by the fates. To be offered everything she had ever dreamed of, only to be forced to refuse it. She shook her head. A violent, jerky motion. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. Kaelen's expression crumpled. The hope in his eyes died, extinguished like a candle in a gale. It was replaced by a hurt so profound, it was like a physical blow. No? He whispered, his voice breaking. He searched her face, looking for any sign, any hint that he was wrong. But all he saw were her tears and her silent, resolute refusal. He misunderstood. He thought she was rejecting him, rejecting the bond, rejecting him. He pulled his hand away from hers as if he'd been burned. He stood up, towering over her once more, the vulnerable man gone, the cold, hard king returning in his place. A wall of ice slammed down behind his eyes. I see, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was worse than his rage. This chilling emptiness was 1,000 times more painful. I was mistaken, he stated, his words like shards of glass. You are not her. He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. The court mages were right. Legends are for children. He strode toward the archway to his own chambers, his back ramrod straight. Take her out of my sight, he called, his voice echoing in the hall outside. Guards appeared instantly, their faces impassive. Take her to the scullery, Kaelen commanded, without looking back. Put her to work. I do not wish to see her again. The great misunderstanding. The chasm that had just opened between them was vast and insurmountable. The guards took her arms, their grips firm but not brutal. They pulled her to her feet. She looked at his back, her heart shattering into a million pieces. No, she screamed in the echoing silence of her mind. You don't understand. I can't. But he couldn't hear her. As the guards led her away, out of the warmth and the firelight, out of the sanctuary she had found, and down into the cold, dark underbelly of the keep, she wept. She had found her mate, only to lose him. She had been cast out. And in the wake of her rejection, she could feel the storm in him begin to rage once more, fiercer and more destructive than ever before. The scullery was a vision of hell. A vast subterranean cavern filled with steam, the stench of old grease, and the endless, clattering noise of pots and pans. It was a place of hard, thankless labor, populated by the lowest of the keep's servants. Her soft wool gowns were replaced with a coarse, scratchy tunic the color of dishwater. Her hands, which had been growing soft, were plunged into scalding water, scrubbing endlessly at blackened pots. The other servants ignored her, isolating her with their silence and hostile glares. They knew she had been the king's something, and now she was nothing. Her fall from grace was a source of cruel satisfaction for them, especially for Seraphina. The jealous servant girl now held a position of minor authority in the kitchens, and she wielded it like a weapon. The mute missed a spot, she would sneer, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a pot Elara had just spent an hour scrubbing. Do it again, and no food until it shines. Elara endured it all. The humiliation, the hunger, the exhaustion. It was nothing compared to the gnawing ache in her chest. The ache of a severed bond. She could feel Kaelen's pain as a constant, low thrum in the back of her mind. His rage, untempered by her presence, was a palpable force that seeped through the very stones of the keep. Rumbling tremors would shake the foundations as he lost control in the training yards. Shouts and the crash of steel echoed from the throne room. The entire keep was on edge, living in fear of their king's broken heart and unleashed fury. He was spiraling, and it was her fault. But there was another presence she felt too. A cold, slithering satisfaction that seemed to emanate from the upper levels of the keep. Lord Valerius, the king's advisor. She would catch glimpses of him sometimes, a fleeting shadow in a high window, his gaze sweeping over the workings of the keep. His face always held a look of quiet reptilian contentment. He was thriving in the chaos. He was taking advantage of the rift she had created. One day, as she was hauling a heavy bucket of scraps to the refuse pile, she saw him. He was standing near the kennels, speaking in low tones to the master of hounds. He held a small, dark vial in his hand. He uncorked it, and a faint, acrid smell drifted on the air. It was a scent she recognized from the deepest, most blighted parts of her forest. The scent of shadow rot. A poison. Valerius poured a few drops of the dark liquid into the water trough for the king's personal warhounds. Elara froze, hidden behind a stack of barrels. What was he doing? The hounds, massive wolf-like beasts, were legendarily loyal to Kaelen. But as they drank from the trough, a change came over them. Their eyes began to glow with a sickly green light. Low growls turned into rabid snarls. They began to pace their cages, throwing themselves against the bars with mindless fury. Valerius watched, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. He was not trying to kill the hounds. He was driving them mad. He was amplifying their aggression. A horrifying realization dawned on Elara. He was doing the same thing to Kaelen. The curse was a fire. Valerius was pouring oil on it. He wanted the king to lose control completely, to become nothing but the beast, so that he, Lord Valerius, could step in and seize power as regent, the calm, rational savior of the kingdom. He was using her rejection of Kaelen as the catalyst for his plan. He needed to get rid of her. She was the only one who could calm the king. She was the only obstacle left. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her. She had to warn Kaelen. But how? He would not see her. And she could not speak. She was trapped. That evening, the chaos in the keep escalated. A scream of pure agony echoed from the royal wing. It was Kaelen's voice. The entire scullery fell silent, the servants frozen in terror. Then, guards stormed into the kitchen's power. Their faces were grim. "The king has been stricken," one of them announced. "A dark magic saps his life force. The court mages say it is the work of a witch." Elara's heart stopped. She knew what was coming. Lord Valerius appeared at the entrance to the scullery, his face a mask of feigned grief and righteous anger. "The king has been in decline ever since she came," he declared, his voice ringing with false authority. "The forest witch who appeared from nowhere." He pointed a dramatic finger directly at Elara. "She enchanted him with her silent wiles, and when he cast her out, she cursed him for it." The servants and guards all turned to stare at her. Their fear and suspicion, fanned by Valerius's words, ignited into hatred. "Seize the witch," Valerius commanded. Seraphina was the first to act. "She's the one," she shrieked, her face contorted with triumphant malice. "I saw her making strange signs over the water. She's a witch." It was a lie, but it was all they needed. The guards surged forward. Elara didn't run. There was nowhere to go. They grabbed her arms, their grips bruising and cruel. "For the crime of witchcraft and high treason against the king," Valerius pronounced, his voice booming in the cavernous room. "You are sentenced to death." He smiled, a flicker of pure evil in his eyes. "You will be sacrificed at the next full moon. Your tainted blood will be used to cleanse the king you have cursed." They dragged her out of the scullery, her feet scraping against the stone floor. She was framed, condemned. As they hauled her toward the dungeons, she passed the entrance to the great hall. For a moment, she saw him. Kaelen was slumped on the throne, his head bowed, his body racked with tremors. He was surrounded by mages, performing frantic, useless rituals. He looked up as she was dragged past. His gray eyes, cloudy with pain and poison, met hers. There was confusion in them, and a flicker of betrayal. He believed it. He believed she had done this to him. That was the blow that finally broke her. As the heavy iron door of the dungeon slammed shut behind her, plunging her into cold, absolute darkness, Elara finally surrendered to despair. Valerius had won. The dungeon was a place devoid of hope. Cold stone walls wept with a perpetual dampness that seeped into her bones. The only light came from a tiny grated window high up in the wall, offering a sliver of gray sky. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water and the distant, mournful groans of other prisoners. She was at her lowest point, alone, condemned. Believed to be a traitor by the one person whose soul was tied to her own. The despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. She curled into a ball on the filthy straw, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, trying to disappear. But as the hours turned into days, something shifted within her. The despair began to burn away, leaving behind a hard, cold core of anger. Anger at Valerius for his treachery. Anger at her father for casting her out. Anger at herself for her own foolish vow, the chain she had wrapped around her own neck. The full moon was in 3 days. Her execution. She would not die like this. A victim. A pawn in another man's game. She pushed herself up, her back against the cold, wet stone. She had to think. Her silence was her prison. But her vow was the key. She closed her eyes, forcing her mind back through the years, back to that terrified night in the forest. She had knelt by a hidden spring, a place the animals had shown her, a place that hummed with a quiet, ancient power. The water was crystal clear, and it pulsed with a soft, internal light. It was a place of healing, a place of life. She had made her vow there, to the spirit of the spring. "I will keep you secret. I will keep you safe. I will not speak a word until I find the one whose heart song matches your magic. The one who is worthy of your healing." The vow wasn't just about finding her mate. It was about protecting the spring, power. If she broke her silence for anyone but the true mate, the spring's magic would be shattered, its healing power extinguished forever. It would become just another pool of ordinary water. And now she understood. The shadow-wrought poison Valerius was using. It was the antithesis of the spring's magic. He wasn't just amplifying Kaelen's curse. He was poisoning the very heart of the land, the source of life that the spring represented. She remembered seeing Valerius near the kennels. The kennels were built near the old, forgotten aqueduct that fed the keep. An aqueduct whose source was her spring. He wasn't just poisoning Kaelen. He was poisoning the water supply of the entire keep. Slowly, subtly, corrupting everything. The king's curse made him the most susceptible, the focal point of the poison's dark energy. But Valerius's plan was bigger. He wanted to corrupt the entire Shadowlands, to twist it into a realm of pure darkness, with himself on its throne. And Kaelen was her mate. His soul, the heart song the vow spoke of, was a perfect match for the spring's magic. His curse was a darkness that only the spring's light could heal. He was the one. He was worthy. All this time, she thought her vow was a cage. It was a weapon. And the time to use it was almost here. To break her silence now, in this cell, would be useless. The vow was specific. The conditions had to be met. She had to claim her mate to forge the bond completely. Only then would her voice unlock the spring's full power. A power that could wash away the poison and shatter the curse. She had to get to Kaelen. A new resolve hardened within her. This was no longer just about saving herself. It was about saving him. It was about saving the kingdom. She stood up and went to the dungeon door, pressing her ear against the cold iron. She could hear the changing of the guard. Their footsteps were heavy, their voices rough. She had no weapon, no strength to fight them, power. But she had her mind. And she had a friend. She reached into the folds of her ragged tunic. With a soft chitter, Pip, the Vesper mouse, poked his head out. He had hidden himself away when she was captured. A tiny, terrified stowaway. She held him in her palm, stroking his soft fur. He had been her companion in silence for so long. Now, she needed him to be her messenger. She looked into his bright, intelligent eyes. She couldn't speak, but she focused all her intent, all her desperation, into her thoughts. Gideon. Find Gideon. The king's second, the one with the scar. Find him. Bring him to me. She didn't know if it would work. It was a wild, desperate hope. But Gideon, for all his brutality, was loyal. He was loyal to Kaelen, not to Valerius. If anyone would listen, if anyone would see the truth, it would be him. Pip seemed to understand. He gave a small squeak of affirmation and looked toward the door. She carried him to the small grate at the bottom of the door, the one used for sliding through food trays. It was just big enough. Go, she thought, pouring all her urgency into the silent command. Be safe, be swift. Pip squeezed through the grate and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor. Elara was alone again. She had sent her only friend on an impossible mission. She had placed her faith in a man who had wanted to execute her in the forest. It was all she could do. Now, all she could do was wait and pray that her message was received before it was too late. The hours crawled by, each one a lifetime. She paced the small cell, her mind racing. She planned what she would do, what she would try to convey to Gideon if he came. Finally, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the heavy tread of the usual guards. A single set of steps, quick and purposeful. They stopped outside her cell. The slot for the key scraped open. Key turned in the lock. The heavy door creaked open. Gideon stood there, his scarred face grim in the torchlight. In his hand, he held Pip, who was chittering excitedly. The beast found me in the armory. Gideon said, his voice a low growl of disbelief. It would not leave me alone. It led me here. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. You have one chance to explain this. Before I decide Valerius was right about you. Elara's heart pounded. This was it. She couldn't speak, but she could show him. She pointed frantically toward the high window, then mimed drinking, then clutched her stomach and contorted her face in pain. Water. Poison. Then she pointed up, toward the royal wing, and repeated the gesture. Kaelen, poison, pride. Finally, she pointed at her own throat, at her silent lips, and then drew a finger across her neck. My silence is killing him. Gideon watched her, his expression stony. For a long moment, he said nothing. Elara's hope began to fade. He didn't understand. Valerius, he finally said, the name a curse on his lips. He has kept everyone from the king, even me. He says the king's malady makes him violent and unpredictable. He looked from her to the mouse in his hand, then back to her. A flicker of understanding dawned in his eyes. You're saying Valerius is poisoning the king, and you are the only one who can stop it? Elara nodded frantically, tears of relief springing to her eyes. Gideon's jaw tightened. His loyalty to Kaelen was absolute, and his suspicion of Valerius's ambition had been simmering for weeks. Her desperate pantomime was the spark that lit the flame. The execution is set for dawn, he said, his voice grim. Valerius will make a grand spectacle of it. He plans to use the cleansing to solidify his position as regent. He looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. The king is weak, but the beast within him, it still fights. It will not let him die. Valerius needs your death to sever the king's last hope. He made a decision. I cannot free you, he said. The dungeon is too well guarded by men loyal to Valerius. To try would be suicide, but I can make sure you get your chance. He stepped back, closing the cell door. Be ready, he said through the grate. At dawn, you will face your execution, and you will face the king. The lock clicked back into place. He was gone. Elara was still a prisoner. She was still condemned to die. But for the first time since she was cast out, she felt a flicker of hope. The stage was set. At dawn, she would face her fate. And she would either save the man she loved or die trying. Dawn broke like a bleeding wound across the sky. The sliver of light from her cell window turned from gray to a sickly orange. It was time. The dungeon door opened, not with a key, but with a grinding of bars being lifted. Two of Valerius's personal guards stood there, their faces hidden behind visored helms. They said nothing. They grabbed her arms and hauled her from the cell. They dragged her up winding stone stairs, from the damp darkness of the dungeon into the cold morning air of the keep. The main courtyard had been transformed. A wooden platform had been erected in the center. A chopping block, its surface stained dark from previous uses, sat ominously upon it. The entire keep had turned out to watch. Warriors, servants, courtiers, they lined the edges of the courtyard, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction, fear, and morbid curiosity. They shoved her toward the platform steps. As she ascended, she saw him. Kaelen was seated on a massive, throne-like chair, placed at the edge of the platform. He was a ghost of the man she knew. His skin was pale and slick with sweat. A dark, feverish flush stained his high cheekbones. His powerful frame was slumped, and his breathing was shallow. But his eyes were open, and they were fixed on her. Clouded with poison and pain, they still held a spark of the storm she knew. He was fighting. Lord Valerius stood at the center of the platform, dressed in immaculate robes of black and silver. He looked every inch, the calm, capable leader stepping in to handle a crisis. His face was a mask of solemn duty, people of the Shadowlands. His voice boomed, magically amplified to fill the courtyard. We gather today in sorrow and injustice. He gestured to Kaelen. Our mighty king, the alpha of alphas, has been struck down by dark witchcraft. His life force drains away, the victim of a vile curse. He turned and pointed at Elara. And here is the source. A forest witch who ensnared our king with her silent deceit, and when cast out, sought her cowardly revenge. A roar of anger went up from the crowd. Witch. Traitor. The guards forced her to her knees, her head pushed down toward the chopping block. The rough, splintery wood scraped against her cheek. It smelled of old blood and fear. But let it be known, Valerius continued, his voice dripping with false piety, that we are a people of strength. We do not bow to darkness. We destroy it. By the ancient laws, the blood of the witch will be used to cleanse the one she has cursed. Her death will be his salvation. Most werewolf stories begin with power and dominance. The executioner, a mountain of a man with a black hood covering his face, stepped forward. He hefted a massive, double-bladed axe, its edge gleaming in the dawn light. This was it. The final moment. Elara lifted her head, defying the guard's pressure. She looked at Kaelen. She had to see him. He was watching her, a terrible conflict in his eyes. The man in him was confused, hurt, betrayed. But the beast, the inner wolf that knew her soul, was fighting the poison, fighting the lies. It knew she was not the enemy. As the executioner moved into position behind her, Kaelen suddenly gasped. He clutched his chest, his body arching in agony. A low, guttural growl of pain and rage escaped his lips. The poison was making its final assault. Valerius smiled. A small, triumphant flicker of a smile. This was the moment he had orchestrated. The king, in his final throes. The witch, about to die. The crowd, baying for blood. The executioner raised his axe. The metal whispered as it sliced through the air. Now. It had to be now. Elara took a deep breath, drawing on a decade of stored silence. She opened her mouth, the muscles of her throat stiff and unfamiliar. She focused all her love, all her desperation, all the magic of her vow into a single word. Kaelen. Her voice, not heard for 10 years, did not come out as a croak or a whisper. It exploded from her. A sound of pure, untainted power. It was not just a shout. It was a shockwave of magical energy, tinged with the life-giving essence of the hidden spring. The sound hit the courtyard like a physical blow. The executioner's axe faltered, stopping inches from her neck. The crowd gasped as one, stunned into silence. The guards holding her stumbled back, their hands flying to their ears. Valerius's face went white, with shock and fury. This was not part of his plan. She was not supposed to have a voice. The sound washed over Kaelen. It slammed into him, not as an attack, but as a wave of pure, cleansing energy. The poison in his veins sizzled, evaporating like water on a hot stone. The feverish flush receded from his skin. The clouds of pain and confusion vanished from his eyes. He shot to his feet, his body no longer slumped but filled with its former strength. The beast within him, which had been raging against the poison, settled into a low, powerful hum, recognizing the voice of its mate. The bond between them, severed by misunderstanding and weakened by poison, snapped back into place, 1,000 times stronger than before. It was forged now, in magic and sound and public declaration. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time since that night. He saw not a traitor, but his salvation. "You," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. Elara scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding with adrenaline and triumph. Her voice, now that it was unlocked, felt like a living thing inside her. "He has been poisoning you," she cried, her voice ringing with clarity and strength as she pointed at Valerius. "He has been poisoning the water, the source of the keep's life. He sought to drive you mad, to break you, so he could seize your throne." The secrets were revealed. The truth, held silent for so long, was now a weapon. Valerius recovered from his shock, his face twisting into a snarl of pure hatred. Lies! The witch speaks lies to save her own skin. Seize her! He shrieked at his guards. But the guards hesitated, looking from the furious advisor to their miraculously restored king. Kaelen took a step forward, his eyes, now clear and sharp as a winter storm, fixed on his treacherous advisor. "Valerius," he growled, and his voice was the sound of an avalanche. "You have betrayed me. You have betrayed my kingdom." "The kingdom will be mine!" Valerius screamed, his mask of civility gone, revealing the mad ambition beneath. "You are a broken beast, unfit to rule. I will remake this land in my own image. Power." He drew a wicked-looking dagger from within his robes, its blade coated with the same dark, oily poison. He lunged. Not at Kaelen. At Elara. If he could not have the throne, he would destroy the one who had ruined his plans. Time seemed to slow. The dagger in Valerius's hand was a black fang, arcing through the air, aimed directly at her heart. The crowd gasped. Elara was frozen, the adrenaline from her revelation giving way to the stark reality of the blade. She had saved Kaelen, but she had not saved herself. But she was not alone anymore. Kaelen moved with a speed that was not entirely human, a blur of black leather and righteous fury. He crossed the platform in a single, powerful stride, his body intercepting Valerius's attack. He did not bother to draw a weapon. He met the traitor with his bare hands. He caught Valerius's wrist in a grip of iron, stopping the dagger inches from his own chest. The sound of bones crunching was sickeningly loud in the stunned silence. Valerius screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and the dagger clattered to the wooden platform. Pause. "You are a fool, Valerius," Kaelen snarled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You tried to poison the beast, but you only succeeded in making it hungrier." With a flick of his wrist, he threw the disgraced lord across the platform. Valerius landed in a heap at the feet of the executioner, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Kaelen turned his back on him, his attention solely on Elara. He walked toward her, his eyes blazing with 1,000 emotions. Relief, awe, regret, and a love so powerful it was a physical force. He stopped in front of her, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, reverent. "Your voice," he whispered, his thumb tracing her jawline. "It's like the dawn." "I couldn't speak," she explained, her own voice trembling with the aftermath of terror and triumph. "I was bound by a vow to protect the spring of life, the magic you needed. I had to wait until the bond was claimed." Understanding dawned in his eyes, washing away the last shadows of his doubt, the rejection, the misunderstanding. It had all been to protect him. "Forgive me," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "I was blind. I hurt you." "You were poisoned," she whispered, covering his hands with her own. "It wasn't you." They had saved each other. Her voice had broken his curse. His strength had saved her from the blade. Their mutual salvation was complete. Their bond forged in fire and truth. A desperate, scrabbling sound made them both turn. Valerius, his face a mask of pain and insane rage, had crawled to the edge of the platform. "If I can't have this kingdom," he hissed, "then no one will." He pulled another smaller vial from his robes. The core poison. He intended to smash it, to release a plague of shadow rot that would blight the entire valley. Before Kaelen could react, Elara acted. She had a voice now, and with it came a power she was only just beginning to understand. She focused on the loyal warriors in the courtyard, on the men like Gideon who served the king, not the traitor. "Seize him," she commanded, and her voice carried not just sound, but the undeniable authority of a queen. It was a command that bypassed the ear and went straight to the soul. Gideon was the first to move. "For the king and queen!" he roared, drawing his sword. The cry was taken up by dozens, then hundreds of warriors. The men who had been loyal to Valerius threw down their arms, their allegiance shifting in the face of the raw, true power they now witnessed. The courtyard erupted as the king's guards surged forward, overwhelming the few who remained with the traitor. Gideon himself leaped onto the platform, his boot stamping down on Valerius's good hand just as he was about to smash the vial. The vial flew from his grasp, rolling to a stop near Kaelen's feet. The antagonist was defeated. His power was neutralized. Kaelen kicked the vial of poison away and looked down at the pathetic, broken man who had been his trusted advisor. Kind. Take him back to the dungeons, Kaelen commanded, his voice cold as the grave. He will await my judgment. As Gideon and his men dragged the screaming, cursing Valerius away, Kaelen turned back to Elara. The courtyard was a scene of chaos and celebration, but for the two of them, the world fell away. There was only the space between them. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, in an embrace that was both fierce and tender. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the curve of his shoulder, breathing in his scent. She was home. My mate, he murmured into her hair. My queen. He tilted her head back, and his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was acclaiming. A brand of possession and a vow of devotion all at once. It was fire and lightning, and the silent, steady strength of the earth. It was the end of a lifetime of silence and the beginning of a song. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his stormy eyes soft with a love that mirrored her own. He was the Beast King, the Alpha of the Shadowlands, and she was the silent girl from the forest. Together, they were a new beginning. He took her hand and turned to face the crowd. The warriors, the servants, the entire populace of the Obsidian Keep fell to one knee. A sea of bowed heads, no longer in fear, but in true, heartfelt allegiance. Kaelen raised their joined hands high. Behold! He roared, and his voice was filled with a pride and joy that echoed off the dark stone of his fortress. Your queen! 1 year later, the Obsidian Keep was transformed. The jagged black towers still clawed at the sky, but now, vibrant green ivy climbed their walls. The courtyard, once a field of packed, dark earth, was now interspersed with garden plots, bursting with hardy mountain flowers and fragrant herbs. The Shadowlands were still a harsh and formidable kingdom, but the oppressive pall of fear had lifted. It had been replaced by a new kind of strength. A balanced strength, tempered by compassion. Queen Elara stood on a balcony overlooking the valley, a gentle breeze stirring her hair. She wore a gown the color of a summer sky, a stark contrast to the dark colors once favored by the court. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved scent of leather and lightning filled her senses. Pite. You are thinking so loudly, my love. Kaelen murmured, his chin resting on her shoulder. Your silence is more expressive than 1,000 poets. She smiled, leaning back against the solid wall of his chest. I was just thinking, she said, her voice still a marvel to them both, that this land is learning to sing again. Her voice, once unlocked, had become a source of healing for the whole kingdom. She had cleansed the spring of life, and its pure waters now flowed freely through the keep and the lands beyond. Where the shadow rot had begun to blight the earth, new growth now flourished. The culture of the court had changed. Brutality was no longer mistaken for strength. Kaelen, with the beast inside him, tamed into a loyal guardian rather than a raging monster, ruled with a firm but just hand. Elara's quiet wisdom and boundless empathy provided the balance he had always needed. They ruled not as two separate powers, but as two halves of a whole. Their grand wedding had been a celebration that lasted a week, a formal uniting of the wild, magical heart of the land and its iron-willed protector. Valerius languished in the deepest cell of the dungeon, his dark magic broken, a bitter, forgotten footnote in the kingdom's new history. Kaelen pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. The land is not the only thing that is singing, he said, his voice soft. He moved his hands from her waist to rest protectively over her abdomen, where a gentle new curve was beginning to show. A miracle. The court mages had long whispered that the curse in Kaelen's bloodline would prevent him from ever siring a healthy heir. They were wrong. The curse was broken. The future was bright. Elara placed her hands over his, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The silent girl who had been sold for being worthless was now a queen, her perceived weakness her greatest strength. The cursed king, who had been trapped in a cycle of rage, was now a beloved ruler, his inner beast soothed by the song of his mate's soul. She had fled into the forest to escape her fate, only to find it waiting for her in the heart of a storm. She turned in his arms, wrapping hers around his neck. "I love you, my king," she whispered. "And I love you, my queen," he answered, his stormy eyes filled with a devotion as vast and enduring as the mountains themselves. "My salvation, my home, my salvation, my home." He kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss, full of promises for the new life they had built together, a testament to a love that had healed not just two souls, but an entire kingdom.